Good morning and welcome to the Ministry of Housing, a digital workshop series. In this series, we will be empowering houses of worship to understand the real estate development process every Tuesday, starting today and ending on May 7th. This program is a partnership between the San Francisco Interfaith Council and DCG Strategies. Today's program is our kickoff, and is there? So in this workshop, we'll explore how to create the vision of housing development, including both a congregational and real estate perspective. And we'll explore general development feasibility. A special thanks, the Ministry of Housing Workshop series is supported by a grant from the San Francisco Foundation. And at this time, I'd like to hand the floor over to the Executive Director of the San Francisco Interfaith Council, Michael Pappas. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Trey. Good morning. I'm Michael Pappas, Executive Director of the San Francisco Interfaith Council, and on behalf of the SFIC and our collaborating partner, DCG Strategies, I want to welcome you to this first segment in a 6-week online series entitled The Ministry of Housing. This series is made possible by a generous grant from the San Francisco Foundation. According to the San Francisco Planning Department records, there are 800 properties in our city owned by religious entities, many of which are underutilized and whose faith communities are struggling financially. At a time when San Francisco is in dire need of more and affordable housing, the leadership of these entities also recognize the moral obligation to be responsible stewards of their properties in order to provide for the greater good. In response to these needs, at the height of the tech boom and soaring real estate prices, the most prominent faith leaders in San Francisco gathered and formed the Interfaith Essential Housing Task Force. Collaborating with and drawing upon the generous wisdom of DCG Strategies, this task force seeks to achieve its vision of helping its diverse constituencies transform their real estate assets so that those properties may realize their potential and help provide the sorely needed housing for San Franciscans who otherwise could not afford to live here and thus would be forced to relocate. Building upon the highly successful recent in-person workshops of the same name, this series is designed to cast a wider net in assisting and supporting congregations and religious institutions contemplating developing their properties for affordable housing. Realizing that developing property in a city like ours can be daunting and is not the primary field of expertise of congregation leaders, it is our hope that the curriculum being offered in this series will provide the unique opportunity for attendees to learn from leading industry experts, including architects, affordable housing finance specialists, developers, attorneys, and the San Francisco Planning Department. Explore public and private funding solutions to support development, and learn ways to partner with real estate professionals to reach their goals. Thank you for taking the time to join us in what promises to be an invaluable learning opportunity. At this time, it gives me great pleasure to introduce friend and valued colleague, Landis Graydon, founder and principal of DCG Strategies. Landis, it's great to see you, my friend. And thank you.
Good to see you too, Michael.
For your leadership here. It's going to be a big day.
Well, thank you. And we're following your lead. And, as your introduction stated, you've been at the forefront of working on one of the biggest crises that we face, which is a lack of housing. And I can just say from working with you, I guess it has been almost 10 years. I just appreciate you being bold and out front, especially when other people weren't. And you were paying attention to this issue. The Essential Task Force leadership was paying attention to this issue. And so we're just glad to be here for the ride and to offer our support, because for us, it's nothing more important. And so just piggybacking off what you said in terms of why we are gathered here this morning is, DCG, we've been around for 20 years, and our work is with faith-based communities across the state of California. And in working with many faith-based organizations working on housing projects, we started noticing early on that there were disparities, and really the faith communities were not equipped, in our opinion, to navigate the complex development process, especially when it came to negotiating what to do with their land and what are the financial arrangements and what are the risks. And this series, along with work we've been doing for many years, is one of our goals is to educate congregations so that they can show up in an empowered way. It's one thing for a congregation to be approached by the developer. The developer has all the core competencies, the institutional knowledge, the technical skills and information, and the faith congregations or the faith communities are put in a position where they just have to trust. And while that's noble, sometimes it works out, but we see a lot of times where it just doesn't, and they don't know until the end. And so this series is created to equip faith communities with how to show up in these projects. And we front load, our advice is to front load the process with information so that before they even go down this pathway, they understand where the landmines lie. They understand what the opportunities for them are. They understand how to drive the conversation. What we don't want is to see where right now they own the land and then they end up getting kicked off the land or just having nothing to show for it but a nice plaque, which in some cases is great. But so, we've assembled some great presenters that are all experts in this field. And one thing that we always check for is they have a heart for this work, because they have to understand how faith communities operate. We operate completely different. I'm an ordained minister in my own congregation, and when we make decisions, it's not about money. It's about how do we serve? What is the greater good that we're trying to accomplish? What is the ministry imperatives? And so this workshop and series is put together with that regard. Today, we're going to focus on, is there a there there? And that's important because we felt there are key fundamental foundational pieces we believe faith communities need to pay attention to before they start entertaining conversations about developing their asset. And so with that, I'm going to bring in Lauren Jennings, who is going to lead us through the beginning, where we typically will start, and then I'll pick up at the end for other considerations.
Awesome. Well, good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for joining us on this Tuesday morning. As Landis mentioned, my name is Lauren Jennings. I am with DCG Strategies, and today's conversation is going to be focused on what we call is there. And so I'll go through I have 2 or 3 slides that will be available just if you would like to take notes, that just have some key questions that we like to focus on. And then as was mentioned at the beginning, feel free to submit your questions. We are definitely happy to take those questions both during and then also towards the end of the presentation as well too. So as Landis mentioned, today's conversation, what I'm going to focus on is just the preliminary development feasibility and really what that means for houses of worship, specifically in San Francisco. And so the topic or the title of today's conversation is there a there, which can kind of be a tongue twister. Like, what do you mean by that? And so these are questions that you can definitely look at and answer on your own. Or these are questions typically, if you are looking to bring in a real estate consultant or a development consultant to help you with, these are 3 questions that we always recommend that really should be answered first and foremost. And it really helps to set the stage in terms of, we know that we have available land, we have vacant land sometimes, and we want to know, is it feasible for development, right? Is development something that we can look at and look towards, and should we spend our time and our resources on it? Because as I'm sure everyone knows, development is a long process and is often it is a very expensive process. And so these are a few of the key questions that we always recommend houses of worship answer before you go into the deep development due diligence, which again can cost a lot of time and resources. And so typically there's 3 questions that we seek to answer. The first one is what is physically possible, and I'll go through examples and scenarios for each of these, but the first one is what is physically possible on your property. The second question that you really want to answer is what is legally permissible. And then the third question is what is financially feasible. And so starting off with what is physically possible, we always say, it's quite simple. What can I physically place on my property? And there's a few things that you want to look at when you're seeking to answer the question of what is physically possible. The first one is we always say you want to order and pull what's called a preliminary title report. A lot of times in the development world, you'll hear title report, PTR, that stands for preliminary title report. And essentially, a preliminary title report is a report of the title of the property, and it goes back to years and years and years, and it has the history of your property. Why it's important for you to pull and receive a preliminary title report is because a lot of times, a preliminary title report will have, if there's any specific development constraints that are tied to your property. These are things such as easements. These are things such as what's called CC&Rs, conditions or restrictions. And what that means is that an easement is essentially, it is an agreement between you as the property owner and some other entity. And an easement can be, for example, that you have an easement on your property where you have piping with the city. The city has piping underneath your property. And typically, if you have an easement on your property, there are development restrictions, meaning that you cannot develop over this strip of land or this piece of land, because essentially, if you were to develop any sort of building or housing over that land, you would make it impossible for whoever the easement holder is to access that piece of land. So it's really important to understand what constraints are on your property, and your title report will assist with that. One example, if you attended the Ministry of Housing in-person conference, I gave this example, but one example is that we were working with a property owner, and we pulled a preliminary title report. And so on the surface, without pulling the report, it looks like they have land available for development, they have vacant land, it's prime to put potentially housing on. We pulled a preliminary title report and realized that actually Hetch Hetchy ran underneath that property. And if you know anything about Hetch Hetchy, you cannot develop over Hetch Hetchy piping. And so that was an actual constraint that we had to consider, because where the piping ran under the property, that severely reduced the amount of developable land. Another example, I also gave this example, is there could be potentially some conditions or restrictions on your property. We were working with a church in Northern California. We're actually still working with them. And we pulled a title report, and the property actually had, it used to be agricultural land way back when. And so there were restrictions on the property that said, if this property were to be developed, it has to only be developed for agricultural purposes, which obviously that is a completely outdated restriction, completely outdated agreement. And so it was a long legal process that the congregation and the house of worship had to go through in order to remove that restriction. So anyways, it's really important to pull that preliminary title report. The second thing that you want to look at when you're looking at what's physically possible is you want to look at, is there access to the vacant land? So a lot of times, if you're a house of worship, you have your main building, and oftentimes there's vacant land that's potentially in the back of the building. You really want to understand, is it landlocked, right? Is there a way for there to be access from the main road to that portion of land? Because they're typically, when you're looking at development, developers ideally would prefer to have 2 different access points. So from 2 different sides of the property, you want to be able to access. And then the last thing that you want to consider if you're answering the question, what's physically possible on my property, is topography, right? Do I have a flat piece of land? That's pretty easy to see from the naked eye, but is my land flat, or is there slope or grading that I need to consider? If you have land that is sloped or that is, has considerable height differences, it does not mean that your land is not feasible for development. However, it does mean that potentially there are additional costs that you would have to bear, or a developer would have to bear, in order to develop, because essentially a development would need a flat piece of land. And so it's really important to make sure that you're taking that into consideration, because you might have, a 2-acre property, but if only 1 acre or a half an acre of that is actually feasible for development, that could look a lot different from 4 acres to 1 acre of land. So those are high level 3 things that we typically recommend congregations and houses of worship look at when you're considering, what is physically possible on my property. The second question that I said, so we got out the way, what is physically possible? The second question is, what is legally permissible? And when we say that, that has to do with what does my local jurisdiction, so in this case, if you're in San Francisco, what does the city of San Francisco allow to be built on my property? Now, I'll say this with a caveat, because there has been a lot of legislation that has been passed over the past few years that has allowed houses of worship to streamline the process of answering the question, what is legally permissible? But essentially what you want to look at is, what is my property zoned for? And you can find the zoning in the San Francisco Municipal Code. And then you also want to understand, what does the general plan say about my property? And the general plan is a development term, or it's a term that every local jurisdiction has. And essentially what you want to confirm is, what is the land use designation for my property? And so those are key, because every city in every jurisdiction, development, I always say development is not haphazard. Development is planned a lot of times 20 and 30 years in advance. And every city and every jurisdiction has some sort of plan for every single parcel and every single piece of land within their surrounding area. And so it's really important to make sure you're aware of what your property is zoned, as well as what the land use designation is for your property, because that dictates what is allowable on your property. Now, when you're looking at residential development, specifically for housing, it's important to look at your zoning as well too, because there's the zoning will also include not only what type of use is allowable, but also what's called development standards. And it could be where housing is allowed, but the development standards say that we're limiting density, which is the number of units per acre, to 5 units per acre. Or the development standard could has things such as what your height allowance is. So those are really important to make sure that you're aware of, because that helps you to understand, okay, what is the boundary, so to speak, from which I have to work with, right? What is the maximum capacity of my site? That's determined by your local jurisdiction. And then also, what's also important is, if your site is not currently zoned for housing and you're looking to develop housing, that doesn't mean that housing is not possible. It's always important also to look at the surrounding contextual influences and contextual patterns. I always say too, like I said, development is not haphazard. So for example, you always want to look at what is surrounding in my neighborhood, what is currently built up in my neighborhood. For example, if you're located in a predominantly single family home neighborhood, it's likely that single family homes would be a potential likely approved use in that area. It's very rare, if not completely impossible, where a city or a jurisdiction would approve a single family home next to a 20-story skyscraper, right? Development and buildings are always clustered together so that the uses are symbiotic to its surrounding. And then last but not least, the third and final question that we seek to answer, and like I said, what's physically possible, what's legally permissible, and then what is financially feasible. And the financial feasibility comes into play on a few different pieces. But essentially, now that I know what my zoning and general plan and my land use designation is, what is the maximum capacity of my site? And when we say maximum capacity, what we essentially mean is what is the maximum number of units that can be developed? And so this potentially, which I believe is next week, would need to be answered by an architect, which like I said, I believe we're going to go into that in more detail with an architect next week. But oftentimes you can get a rough back of the napkin without using a detailed site plan. But essentially, what we want to do is back of the napkin, are we looking at maybe 5 units of housing, or is it closer to 30, 40, 50 units of housing? The reason why that's important is, especially for affordable housing, there are certain economies of scale that affordable housing developers will look towards and oftentimes will require in order to make a project, so to speak, pencil for them, to make it financially feasible for them. And generally, a rough rule of thumb is affordable housing developers typically require a minimum of 50 units in order for a affordable housing project to become financially feasible for them. The reason is as like I said, there are certain economies of scale that come with development, and anything under 50 units typically is extremely difficult to pencil. Now, that does not mean that you cannot do affordable housing on your site if you have less than 50 units. But what that means is that generally speaking, the majority of affordable housing developers will require that, obviously with a couple of nuances and a couple of variances, based on the property itself. Also, if you are considering especially affordable housing, well, in general, the question is, are there financial resources available for the property, right? That definitely goes into financially feasible. Development costs money. It costs a lot of money. There's funds that are needed for what's called pre-development, which is all the initial due diligence, the soil studies, civil engineer, the architect for site planning. There's costs that are needed for that. And then there's also costs of, once I do that, then I need to actually go through and receive entitlements, which entitlements are essentially the permission to build from the city. That costs money. It costs money in terms of fees. It costs money in terms of staff time with the city. And so there's expensive fees that are associated with that. And then the last piece is obviously the most expensive is construction. It costs to be able to fund construction. And these are things that I'll give the caveat that houses of worship would need to consider if you're looking to build housing internally on your own. But oftentimes, typically houses of worship will partner with a developer, so a development partner, and they'll bring the cash and the resources to be able to fund those expensive pieces. However, though, when you're still considering, is this financially feasible? You would still want to consider, are there financial resources available in terms of affordable housing? And when a developer is looking at affordable housing sites, there is literally a spreadsheet where they rate and rank sites. And so they'll always say, how does the project score? And there's a variety of different questions and different items that a developer will look at to literally see how will the project score. Is it close to amenities? Is it close to a grocery store? What is the closest bus stop? Is there transportation nearby? All of those key items are important when considering affordable housing on your property. And it's important to know what your property scores, because that is essentially your rating sheet in terms of if you're looking to get local subsidies and funding. The local jurisdiction will rate your property to determine which property is ideal to give funds. There's always only a limited number of resources. And so if they have 10 applications for properties and they only have funding for 4, they're going to rate and rank and see, okay, well, which property scores the highest so that we can give these funds to. And the other thing is, when you're looking at financial resources, is there local funding available? You know, does my local jurisdiction have funding, have a NOFA, a notice of funds availability for affordable housing to be able to support the project? And then the last piece is, can the property's cash flow, sustain operations? That likely will need to be completed by a financial consultant or a financial advisor. But those are really key important topics to make sure, again, is the project financially feasible? So in summary, 3 questions that you really want to seek to answer is, what is physically possible on my property? What is legally permissible? And also, what is financially feasible in terms of the number of units and the resources that are available to finance the project? I'll pause there and then I'll hand it over to Landis, who will go through the next step.
And you can keep it on that slide just for a second before you move
Okay,
to my slide. So I just wanted to elaborate just a little bit more on the financial analysis piece. And so just to provide some additional context is, when Lauren refers to scoring, she's specifically talking about tax credits in particular. And tax credits in the state of California, which we will actually have a consultant coming on as part of this series to get deeper into that. But tax credits are very competitive. And so the state has a scoring system in which it evaluates the competitiveness of any given site, because those programs are often oversubscribed, meaning there's not enough money to go around. So they have to have some mechanism for screening. And so also, when she talks about the NOFA, local funding, it's also a very important factor to be competitive for tax credits, meaning is the local jurisdiction invested? Because that could be something that, if you have one project and they score evenly, but one has local dollars invested and one doesn't, it's likely going to go to the one where there's local investment. So the whole notion of what we're talking about today is there or there. This is when someone's, as Lauren mentioned earlier, they have a piece of land or they're thinking about acquiring a piece of land for housing. And before folks, we recommend, these are best practices, things to look at as an initial litmus test, if you will, just to make sure that it's worth that investment of time. And I'm going to talk about that why next. Also, there are occasions where there is the talent inside the faith community to do some of this preliminary work on behalf of that community. Oftentimes there isn't. So at my ministry, I can do this work. And obviously I'm not billing my ministry, but we do recommend that you have an owner's rep to go through these processes with you. Someone who's actually understanding of how to pull a title report, analyze a title report, work through some of the potential deed restrictions or other constraints that could be in a title report. Someone who knows how to scan for access, someone who can run a back of the napkin cash flow analysis. So we're not suggesting that you should do all of this yourselves, but what we are saying is this is where you start. This is where we believe best practice is having this information understood before you go down a path of inquiry further or spend money on due diligence or start hiring a bunch of consultants. Why we do this is because resources, and you can flip to the next slide now, resources are very precious. And so none of us really have finite resources. And what we've seen in just our time is we'll often engage with a community where they say, oh, we wish we knew you a year ago or 2 years ago. We spent $100,000 and we learned at the end that we didn't have a project. And there's, I'm not disparaging anyone else's process. We just like to do things iteratively because we like to preserve resources and we like to continually invest as we see a promise of success. And that's just the practice that we've established over the years, and it's been very successful. And so early on, just with some of those things in mind. What is physically possible? Is this financially feasible? What is legally supportable? You're having those questions up front in your mind so that you at least have that baseline information, and you're just not at the behest of some other entity that's just going to just kind of drive this process, and you're not equally yoked, so to speak. So there are two distinct processes that we recommend happen. We think you look at the land first, very high level, as Lauren walked through. Those are considered to be high level. So we looked at a site, a couple weeks ago, and it was a great site, plenty of land in a great location that would have been fantastic for housing, but it had zero access. It had literally one road in because it was surrounded by established single-family homes. And and it also has slope, and we just knew that it would be a nightmare trying to figure out how to acquire an easement through a neighbor's yard to create a secondary access. So that allowed us to eliminate it. Another was there was a site that was just literally, I won't say on the bay, but it was a waterfront property, and there was coastal erosion. And so we were quickly able to determine that this site will not be suitable for long-term development because there's coastal erosion at that location. So we were able to eliminate that from consideration up front. What happens is you could spend all the time and money, and then you get a year into it, and you've spent time and money to learn that you have no project. So that's just our way to be offensive. When I mean offensive, I mean like offense versus defense. Like you're being proactive, and you're creating these processes that protect you. And that leads me to this next point. So we look at the physical property first, just to determine is there, and then we come internally. And this is making sure that now we have the physical properties aligned. Now we need to make sure all the people that need to make this happen from the faith community side is aligned. And after these two processes, then we'll know if there's a there. And that's when, and there's a particular order to this, that's when we'll be ready to engage an architect, because we've said the site can support housing. It's a great location. We can get the density. Financially, there's a path forward. And then we're going to go through this information. And then we'll say, we have a development potential. And then we're going to engage an architect, which is our next session. And that's when we start spending money. So the first thing that we recommend, and we've seen this done well, and we've seen this done in cases where it split the community in half. And we've seen some tragic stories behind this. So we try to prevent that. We believe the first thing you should do is review just whatever your organizational governance documents are for your tradition. We understand, so I'm just going to use church as an example, but I'm not saying this applies exclusively to churches. But the reason I can use church as an example is because there are cases where they're just independent churches that are not affiliated with some bigger denomination. So their local governance documents are just right there within that local community. There are other cases where that faith tradition, I'm using a church as an example, belongs to a corporate denomination. And different corporate denominations have different governance structures. Some, the local church controls their real estate, and they can make all their decisions. Others, they're holding it in trust with the broader corporate church. And so just knowing what those requirements are, what your processes are, how you are able to legally pursue housing is critical, because and we have a lawyer coming on at some point, there is going to be a need for formal agreements that get signed, MOUs, memorandums of understanding, development agreements, et cetera. So you need to understand what those documents are, because the last thing you want to do is get all the way through this process and learn that you need approvals that you can't obtain. And using church as an example, we've worked with a number over the years of church communities that are where the Vatican is headquarters. And we've had to go to the Vatican for approval on numerous occasions, and that's not something that happens in 30 days. So we know how to navigate. And so we think it's just good for you to understand that. After you understand what your governance structure is and what your approval process is, we then think, and these are best practices, that it's good to have a few local champions internal to that faith community, folks that are going to carry the day, folks that are going to be the cheerleaders, folks are going to put in the long hours of just recruiting people, keeping people motivated, organizing. This is good to have that, whether it's a committee and we think it should at least be 2 folks, but committees are really good if they're small and well aligned, but just making sure you have those internal champions. And then having a good communication plan for your local community. That's critical. What we've seen in our situations is where we've seen cases where we think it's best practice, where they'll have an entire meeting of the entire body when they have information where they can present. They say, we've looked at the site, and sometimes the leader of the organization or the governing trustees, if there's a trustee board or a lay board or whatever, however you're organized, housing could be localized and inspired by one person or a small group, or it could just be something that you've talked about broadly. It's typically we see both. We'll see where the organizational leader is like, I want to do housing as a legacy, and then they have to bring along everyone else, and this person's ahead of everyone else. And then in other cases, they've been having this conversation. The larger the organization, the less we find everyone is on board with it. The smaller the organization, it increases the odds that everyone's on board. But the point is having a good understanding of who all the stakeholders are, how are the decisions made, where is the momentum going to come from internally? Are there folks internally that disagree with this? The worst case I've ever seen is, and I'm using a church as an example. We worked with a church in the Bay Area a couple years ago, and they were governed by a majority congregational vote, and it was a simple majority, and they had a pretty healthy congregation. There were over 100 people, and what they had was shifting demographics in their body, and over time they ended up with a lot of younger college students as members, and they had a remnant of folks that were there 50 years ago, and these were elderly folks, and there was about maybe 10, because I met with them quite a bit. The 10 elderly folks were very much attached to the physical structure. They had been there their entire lives. They never moved, and funerals, weddings, you name it, they've been there, and this was very much a part of their life, emotionally, spiritually, and physically. And they just couldn't see tearing down the building to build housing. And it was a great housing site. They had a pastor who had only been there for about 3 years, forward thinking. And they had a lot of young people, which made up about 70% of the congregation, who needed housing. And that's another thing. The older folks had housing because they had been there for a long time. The younger folks had no place to live. So they thought this was a great idea. So they pushed the congregational vote through. It passed by overwhelming majority. And what they did was they just ran over this remnant group of folks who had a very valuable voice. But we have the votes, we passed it, they memorialized it in their corporate documents, and they actually went into contract with a developer. And these folks that they ran over organized and protested and brought in the news. They brought in historical preservationists. They brought in some of the NIMBY folks, and they actually stopped the development from going forward after a year of this. They fired the pastor, and then the majority of the church left. Now they're struggling. I don't know what they're going to do, but in hindsight, the pastor said, I shouldn't have gone so fast. I should have slowed down and just, if it took another 2 years, I should have waited. So I wanted to spend extra time on this because it's so important to have alignment. Now, having internal alignment where there is enough buy-in and your organization to move forward is what we recommend. We don't often see a 100% majority. So, but where your dynamic is. So the point I'm making is make sure that you have a good plan for internal communications in an alignment, knowing that there may be some folks who just won't come along, but we feel great that we have enough of a momentum that at least they're not going to protest, they're not going to stop the project, they may not like it. After you have that internal alignment, and this applies where there maybe is a broader organizational structure in place, So I know a lot of churches in particular have this that are affiliated with broader denominations, and sometimes it isn't. But what is that plan for the broader communication if you need approvals at a corporate level? And so we think this is a great process because you want internal local alignment first before you now take it outside of the local community. Because if there is this misalignment or if there's tension, that could be a barrier at the broader approval process. And we really say replicate what you do internally, externally. So if you do have a corporate governance structure that kind of regulates your local faith community, understanding what that approval process is, understanding how those decisions are made, understanding if you actually need formal legal authority or just some, it's just a notification process, having a good communication plan, and also having champions if you need them is critical. And so if you've even just noticed where we are, everything is iterative. And then now let me just take a moment and pause and explain to you why. We don't want to, and I'm going to wrap up because I have 2 more minutes. We don't want to, if the property is not, if it's missing an element where the property itself isn't feasible, you don't want to get folks internally happy in a line just to disappoint them. If the property is feasible and there are folks at the higher governance structure that wants this, but the local community's attention, then that's a process of a potential stop too. So you want to just do these things in order. And the last piece, and I'll end here, and then we'll go to Q&A, is after you've done all that, then we think it's a great idea to do your local, your external outreach. That's where you're getting the either the temperature or the buy-in from just the local policymakers. Now, there is legislation that will streamline a lot of the entitlement process, which is going through the city planning process to get approvals for building, but you still want to have good relationships because you still need that cooperation. So you're looking at local policymakers, whether they're champions or not, you may need funding from them. And then the community in general, are there people in the community that are going to support our project? And you also need to be aware of people that will organize against it, so you have a plan for that. And then just having a good plan for community stakeholder engagement, which we'll talk about at a later time, but we're just saying you also early on want to be thinking about how this project that we're contemplating, whether that be workforce housing, which all these principles apply to workforce housing, as well as subsidized affordable housing. So making sure you're aligned internally, making sure you're aligned with the broader organization if that applies to you, and having a good, robust plan for external stakeholder communication. And so when you get through this, then we think you can check the box and say, yep, everything checks, we're ready to proceed forward. So we'll pause now for Q&A. And I know Mike also has some questions.
Thank you.
Thoughts.
This is a lot of information, and I'm guessing that some of the folks out there attending today have some nuanced questions, and we would encourage you to put those questions in the chat because your question might be a question somebody else has but is hesitant to ask. And so I think it's going to be really important that you ask those questions. I know early on in the chat, one person asked, will we be getting this dashboard? Not only will you be getting this dashboard by day's end today, but you'll get this entire recording link. We'll be sending it out to our 5,600 e-subscribers, and we encourage you to share this with your colleagues and friends as well. I wanted to drill down, Landis and Lauren, on a couple of these issues that both of you brought up. And to give some context in terms of asking these questions, I just want to share with you how Landis came into the life of the Interfaith Council. Because when the faith leaders in San Francisco formed the Interfaith Essential Housing Task Force and took it to Mayor Lee, he was thrilled and put his arms around it. And the next thing you knew, we had a parade of developers and finance folks that were looking at the fact that these properties were now available. And after a while, we found out they all had one thing in common, and not all of them had the best interest of the congregations in common. At which point, the president of the University of San Francisco introduced us to Landis. And Landis, you used a term earlier, owner-operator, owner-representative. I think that this really put the faith leaders at ease, knowing that there was somebody who was going to represent their best interests. And if I remember correctly, if we were to take a step back, at that time you were working with Claremont School of Theology, and we're really emphasizing the importance of spiritual discernment and mission alignment. I'm wondering if you could take a moment and just talk a little bit about that process. You go in to meet with a congregation. How do you help them with that spiritual discernment and that mission alignment, taking baby steps?
Yeah, no, that's a great perspective, Michael, and I think it's critical. And you know, what we find is even though there are some communities that are well ahead in terms of we're all focused on affordable housing, a lot of times you might find them needing just we want to do something good. We have land. Can this land work? But we're really not sure. Is it housing? And if it's housing, is it workforce housing? Is it affordable housing? Is it senior housing? Should we open a food pantry? And we always say that's a process where you want to be spiritually aligned. So like a member of our team, Megan, she actually will go out and lead that discernment. And that discernment is a very spirit-led process where you are able to settle into whatever that missional ministry imperative. And we have to take our time with that. It's a sacred process where we're walking with that community and helping them come into alignment with what is their broader ministry imperative for their real estate. And it's sometimes it's because we're an uninvested neutral third party, and we're not going to take the side of one part. If there are competing ideas, we're safe, and people can just have a transparent, trusted process to know that we're going to bring everyone into alignment. It doesn't mean that it will be unanimous, but we have to make room for that. You know, they have to have the time and the space to really fill into and pray into, or whatever their tradition is, to get into, okay, we're going to move in this direction. So that I'll just thank you for calling that out.
And I want to thank you too for giving that example of how a community can become divided, because going through these projects, it really is an opportunity to unite the community, and it's an opportunity to use your assets in a way to unite. I guess since I'm sitting in this position, I can see some of the questions. Would you mind if I just ask the questions and you and Lauren can chime in and give the answers? Does that work? Okay.
Yes, sure.
From Scott Taylor, what do you do if the project seems to pencil, but there's a small shortfall, then you may need to fundraise for? Have you come into that experience?
All the time.
Okay.
We have one project that's in construction right now. It's a senior project. It's in West Oakland. I want to say I started working on that with the church in 2017. I want to say it was 2017, and they just broke ground this year.
I think maybe 2016.
Maybe 2016.
Yeah,
That sounds
it's been
about
7 or
right.
8 years since we did the initial is there. Yeah.
So I think what that question is actually probably relative to a lot of, it's probably true for a lot of projects. It's just a very patient process. It's not going to happen overnight, and the money's going to come in tranches, and sometimes you'll get the commitment and the commitment will go away. You're often going to have to fundraise. That's why those internal champions are critical, because this could be a multi-year process, and it could take 5 years, 10 years. Sometimes folks are fortunate to get the funding right away, but sometimes they're not. So you just have to be committed. That internal organization and alignment is just critical, so that you keep your focus on the main thing, which is getting to housing.
Someone else asks, what is involved with pulling a title report?
Good question. So an escrow company, the same escrow companies that do residential are the same escrow companies. And so I don't want to leave anyone out, but we might have heard of Fidelity or Chicago Title or Old Republic Title. I'm sure there's many others, so I'm not giving them in a commercial, but that's where you you would have them pull a preliminary title report, which is everything recorded legally against your property at the county office. Liens, easements, restrictions, things like that. And if you have a great relationship, sometimes they won't charge you.
Okay.
But we think you should have your consultant pull that for you because they'll be able to interpret it.
From James Fagler, will we be discussing legal ownership of property and the land, especially if the worship entity would like to maintain a worship space in the 100% affordable housing property? This use of worship space in the project has been a holdup on our development analysis.
Yes, we absolutely will. We're bringing in someone from Gopar and Lippman, Diane, and she's going to talk about the different legal structures. We have a personal bias, which is we always want to partner. We want our clients to partner with developers that will partner with them, and they'll be a part of the legal ownership group, as well as sharing a development fee. And whether that's a long-term land lease or you just have your ownership in the limited liability company that gets formed, we will discuss that in detail of how to show up. And just as an aside, when we did I don't know if you were at our Hayward session, but we did bring two churches up, and it was a tale of two different scenarios. One church was aware and had this information, so they were able to fully participate and maintain control of the land in partnership. And they also split the developer fee, which is over $1 million. And one church didn't even know that was an option, and they didn't get any money, and they don't have control of the land. So yes, we will cover that.
From Eric, one of the biggest constraints we have seen to date is the funding. Churches that are land rich and cash poor and are restricted under SB 4 to develop low-income housing only. Churches want to retain property ownership control as well as oversight on residents permitted to live in the housing community. What are the primary pathways to funding, and have you developed any pathways to equity and/or ownership of residents as well? We would love to see housing as either attainable on a property or at least have an equity equivalent to build up assets over time. Your thoughts?
So that's a deep multi-part question. I'll just take a couple pieces. First of all, I can just say, there are fair housing laws that regulate how you lease units. And so having control over who moves in, that's often regulated by the government. But with how do you develop equity, or what are alternative funding sources? For those of you that are in Northern California, especially in San Francisco, we all know property is very expensive. So this is a question there is no one size fits all. One thing that we have a couple projects now where we're working with the notion of, and these are workforce housing projects, so these are not publicly subsidized. We're working on the model of a mixed income approach, where the congregate or the faith community invests their land into the partnership, and then they have a development partner who is going to build it and invest the money to build. There is some partnership agreement about who owns what equity and how does a property control. Those we've seen, at least on paper pencil, when they're mixed income, because without the public subsidies, it's the market units that are able to drive enough revenue to help offset the lower income units. But we think joint venture could be a pathway there with the right partner, and that's going to be driven by the location itself. So the joint venture is one way we've been, I won't say exploring to help the owner, which is in this case a faith community, maintain control, share in the financial resources, and fill that gap.
One example, Landis, that we could share is we worked with a church in the East Bay. They developed 8 units of housing, and it was exactly what Landis said. It was a mixed income project. So 4 of the units were market rate, and then 4 of the units were workforce housing. And essentially workforce housing is the middle. It's like the missing middle. It's for people who make too much money to qualify for affordable housing, but don't make enough money to be able to still live in the communities in which they live and serve and work. And so this particular church, like I said, 4 of the units were market rate, 4 of the units were workforce housing. and the 4 market rate units helped to subsidize the gap for the lower rent that was paid for the workforce housing. And in particular, this church, the four workforce housing units that they had, they specifically wanted for their youth pastor, because I believe their youth pastor, they were in Fremont, and then the youth pastor lived all the way in Tracy. So had a very long commute. So they used those 4 units for their church leaders, their church leaders. This one is a little different though, because the church did have an endowment fund, and so they were able to fund the projects internally through fundraising. And so just giving that caveat, but typically, like as Lana said, mixed income is what we see congregations looking towards.
We have 3 more questions on the books now. And so we're going to ask those questions. We might go over a minute or 2, but we'll ask those questions. Can you talk, this is from Carol, what if a congregation has a smaller parcel and wants to build just a few units? Can you speak to how that pencils out?
Yeah, and so that's and Lauren, the project Lauren just mentioned was a smaller
Okay.
site. It's gonna come down to, can you build the units legally, right? Land use, zoning, et cetera, and then how do you pay for it? It's all the other fundamentals are still going to apply, but it's gonna come down to a few units are gonna be, if you have the financial resources, then you're golden. It's just, does the land support it? And then we can build it. And if you don't, you have to fundraise, but it is possible.
I was very happy for you to talk about that you spoke earlier about who has the authority to make decisions. Saul Perez asks this question, and I see my friend Julian Benalis on the line from the planning department. When I have taken he and the director of planning, Rich Hillis, to meet with judicatory heads, the first question we ask is who has authority to make decisions. Saul asked the question, can you describe in more detail the example of going to the Vatican for approval?
Yeah, sure. So that's just a great example. So the local church was a Catholic order, and they had already approved it within their bylaw. So I know Jim has an online question. It's a lot of or corporations. So there's typically corporate bylaws governing the body. So they approved it, but because the property is owned technically by the Catholic Church at large, the Vatican is the only authority in this case where they actually have to approve the sale of the asset to another private party. And so the local, in this case, it was a sisters religious organization. We've done several of these where they weren't sisters religious. They actually sent their resolution over for approval to the Vatican. And it took a while. And the Vatican said, we permit you to sell this asset.
On that note, too, I would say that in our conversations with the Archdiocese, there's a director of real estate for the Archdiocese, and we go get their counsel in terms of who has this authority and get a blessing, too, from them to proceed, or else you're sort of just spinning your wheels. The final question comes from Susan. 2 organizations who developed affordable housing shared that their financial modeling for long-term operations has not been what they anticipated. It would surprise me if they had not involved a competent financial consultant, but there's still more cost than projected. Is the protection for this to build in significant greater reserves, even if, excuse me, just popped up here, even if doing so could then make the project a non-go?
Yeah, great question, and it's a great way to cap. So this is where we always think it's a great idea for you to have your own internal financial consultant run the numbers first. The reason I say that is because it becomes political. So the affordable housing developers, and we work with them all, and the ones we work with, we love them. So they're great organizations doing great work, but they're corporations with their own internal processes, and assumptions are made. When you're projecting out 30 years, those are all assumptions. And so Sometimes it's easy for assumptions to make a project pencil to get the project done. If there's pressure on the land acquisition folks, or if there's just competition, and to your point, we always look at it very soberly. So we take are these assumptions valid? And we look at it more conservatively because we don't have a vested interest in the project. So we're going to be able to think through, is it realistic that these rents will continue to escalate? Is it realistic that costs won't go up? And we're going to check those assumptions. And then if you do all that you can do, and you build in the reserves, and you build in the conservative, if you make sure the assumptions, in our opinion, should be conservative, if it doesn't pencil, then that's a risk. And at least, if nothing else, that risk should be documented, that there is a chance that the project could run into negative cash flow because these assumptions could be lacking when you get deeper into the timeline.
I think one additional thing to add, if there's time, is that also is why it's really important, one, to have an owner representative, but then two, to make sure your legal documents are in order. Because then the question becomes, well, if there is a year where the project doesn't cash flow, who is responsible for it? Does it come, is the church or is the house of worship responsible for paying some of that downfall? Or is the developer? We had a congregation that came to us. It was after they had signed an agreement, and they had exactly experienced that same situation, and they were responsible for it, and they were not aware that they were responsible for paying that money. And so that's why it's really important to make sure, when you have an owner representative who's reading all that legalese and who knows, hey, this is what this means, and maybe we should negotiate this part, as well as have an attorney that can make sure that you're protected throughout the entire process, because that has happened. We have seen that happen before.
And be willing to walk away if necessary.
Have either of you ever sat in the pew and the pastor, it's taken him a little while, he says he's closing the sermon, but he ends up, it takes him 2 or 3 more times. We have a couple of other great questions, and so if you'll permit me, we're going to ask them out of respect for the folks who asked them, but also because I think that they'll be of benefit to everybody. From Marta Struthers, is there a feasibility for congregations to consider the middle area of housing between the single manse / caretaker unit or high density greater than 50 apartments? Many of our properties are an acre in a single family neighborhood, where a duplex, 4-plex, or 8-plex would be visually and conceptually compatible and manageable.
Lauren, you can take that. I see you shaking your head.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's I think you can create whatever you want architecturally. I mean, it's going to need to fit into the context of the neighborhood, but whether it's because we're working on a project now where what you just said, there are like 3-unit townhomes, and they'll give us the density we want, but it's bigger than an acre. So I think the programming piece is where you partner with your architect and just walk through those various scenarios. And then when you get to something that you know is going to work for you organizationally, and then you believe it will work for the zoning, then it just becomes, how does it cash flow?
Yeah, I'll add to that piece. I would say, because I know exactly what you're speaking of, Marta, there's a lot of houses of worship that have land. And then the question always is, but is this enough land to get the density or the number of units to make a project pencil? And that we oftentimes come across that, where a house of worship will have half an acre. And, with such small size of land, then you have to go up in order to get, the approximately 50 units. And so, as Landis mentioned, yes, you can do architecture work. I'm sure it can fit from a physical capacity standpoint. So, is it physically possible? Yes. The hard part is it financially feasible? And typically, that rule of thumb applies across the board for affordable housing. In order to get, actual financing for it, it has to be, like I said, roughly 50 units. So if you're looking at anything substantially less than that, the project can still happen physically, but the congregation or the house of worship would have to fundraise for it. And that's typically, unfortunately, where we see a lot of projects, unfortunately, stall or take a pause, is because it's extremely expensive to be able to do so. One option that we've been exploring, or we've talked to houses of worship about, is maybe not doing your traditional, development, but maybe modular development, which a lot of times typically has lower costs associated with it for construction. And then also tiny homes, that could potentially be an option too. And then the last thing is what's called scattered site development, which is essentially where you have development across scattered sites, multiple properties. And so it might not be where you can't fit 50 units on your property, but within a certain small radius, there's 3 different parcels where together, this is where we can get the density and the number of units that are allowable. And then there could be potentially affordable housing developers who could be interested in that. So if you have that smaller piece of land, and if you're not sure you can get the density, we typically say potentially like have your consultant, or we will look, or something, reach out to congregations or houses of worship in your surrounding area, and see if you could potentially partner together on a development so that you can get that density and the number allowable.
I promise this is going to be the last question. From Betsy. Opportunities with community land trusts or cooperative resident management, or even limited equity ownership of new housing. Can you speak to that? Over a dozen such secular housing communities are already in existence in San Francisco.
That's not an area that we've been in. So I don't think I could personally, unless Lauren feels otherwise, I don't think I can provide any value commenting on that. We haven't really worked with a lot of land trusts or co-ops. I'm aware of the concepts, I've studied them, but it's not something that we've actually worked on. Lauren, do you have a different answer?
Okay. Thank you both. And I know that we have more segments coming up where we'll drill down. This was sort of the 10,000-foot overview, and we're going to be addressing these issues in greater detail as the series progresses. Once again, we thank you for your participation, to the folks who attended in this inaugural segment of the series entitled The Ministry of Housing. We look forward to reconnecting next week when we will examine the theme, How to Partner with an Architect. We encourage you to help spread the word and invite friends and colleagues to join us. This concludes today's program. Have a blessed rest of your day. Thank you, and God keep you.